Welcome to Denver Startup Week. I'm Ben Data, co-chair of DSW. This year marks the 10-year anniversary of Denver Startup Week. This community has been the catalyst for lots of change over the past decade, and this week we're coming together to celebrate the past and dream big for the future. We are able to bring Denver Startup Week to this community thanks to our 2021 sponsors. Thank you to our HQ and title sponsor, Amazon, and our title sponsors, whose leadership makes this week come to life. Capital One Cafe, Downtown Denver Partnership, Fluid Truck, Hotel Engine, and WeWork. And our track sponsors, who have made all of the great content you're hearing today possible. Founder Track, Kickstart, Growth Track, Friday Health Plans, Developer Track, Quizlet, Product Track, Palantir, Designer Track, Battery 621 in the Public Works, People Track, Exactly, and Spotlight event sponsor, Strat Labs. Our headline event sponsors are bringing the excitement this week. Thank you to B-Side Fun, Colorado Public Radio, Comcast, Coors Brewing Company, Denver Pavilions, Entrepreneurship at the University of Denver, Gusto, JP Morgan Chase, Method, Moss Adams, Pine Insurance, Promontory Mortgage Path, Red Bull Basement, Southwest, Tattered Cover, and VF Venture Foundry. Finally, thank you to our partner and member sponsors listed on the screen. Please say thank you to these companies as you enjoy our hybrid Denver Startup Week. And don't forget to use hashtag Den Startup Week to share your experience and moments of inspiration on social media. Have a great week.
Early risers, all-nighters, slow pours, fast crams, post-nap, on the mat, in the stacks, phone down, volume up, complete silence. You ups? Coffee cups, pizza crusts, first semester, fourth quarter. Focus 100, privacy 0. Pre-test, one last check, let's go. However you study, Quizlet takes the guesswork out of your coursework. Learn it, own it, Quizlet.
Hello everyone, welcome to Denver Startup Week. I'm Connor Swanson, the Developer Track co-chair along with Aaron Clark, and member of the Denver Startup Week Organizing Committee. Thank you for joining us for the 10th anniversary of Denver Startup Week. At Denver Startup Week, we strive to make all of our sessions a space where attendees can connect, learn, and grow, regardless of age, gender identity, gender expression, race, ability, or sexual orientation. A special thank you to all of our sponsors for their support in helping us to keep DSW free and accessible for all. Thank you for joining us, and have a great week.
Hi, y'all. Welcome. My name is Christy Madison, and I am the president and CEO of Abseil Corporation. We're a local Denver company specializing in cybersecurity consulting, custom software development, and encryption software libraries. I want to thank you all for joining us today for a panel discussion on shifting data protection to the left. I am joined by 4 esteemed panelists who will introduce themselves in just a moment. But we want to let you know about a few items. First off, please feel free to enter questions throughout the discussion by clicking on the Q&A button in the ribbon at the bottom of the Zoom interface. We'll try to leave some time at the end to answer the questions directly from the audience. In addition, there will be several poll questions that I'll be launching here shortly that we'd love for you to answer to get a better sense of how you and your own software development organizations think about and prioritize data protection. So please complete those when you get a chance, and we'll reveal some of the results later on. Now, I'd like to provide each of our panelists with an opportunity to briefly introduce themselves. Gus, can you start us off?
Sure, Christy, thanks. Delighted to join you. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gus Hunt. I am currently run my own consulting company, Hunt Technology. But I have a 28-year career over at CIA, where I retired from there a few years ago as the Chief Technology Officer, brought in C2S and a bunch of other things like that, and then led the Accenture Federal Services cybersecurity group before coming back to a private consulting practice again. So happy to be here and delighted to be joining you.
Great. David?
Yes, I'm David Krueger. I'm also with Abseil and have been with them since the beginning. I'm one of the co-founders. Have been doing This is my fourth software company. I've had one B2B, one B2C, and then two that have developed software developer tools. And I have prior to that was in for a little over 20 years in process and transport safety. So different career, but I've been either developing software or managing software development teams since the middle 1980s, a very long time.
Great. Anand?
Hi, everybody. I'm from South Denver, work for Dish Network. I'm principal engineer here. My day-to-day job involves maintaining Linux kernel, tool chains, which we use on the Linux, Dish Linux platforms. And I also mentor a lot of junior engineers. So how to write secure code, what things you need to consider, things like that. So I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Great. And last but not least, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Christy. My name is Chris Meyer. I'm the director of sales at an organization called Elementary Systems, which does machine vision for manufacturing. Previously, I was the director of partnerships at an Internet of Things consortium called Riot. So I have a lot of experience with edge devices in a variety of capacities. So really excited to be here.
Thank you all for those introductions, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. Despite increasing annual expenditures of hundreds of billions of dollars and millions of man-hours of labor on cybersecurity solutions, the number and magnitude of data breaches continues to increase every year. Gus, you've been involved in cybersecurity for most of your career. Can you provide the audience with some insights into the causes of some of the recent breaches and why things appear to be getting worse rather than better?
Well, in my book, they're definitely getting worse rather than better. So no appearance here. It's actually happening. Yeah, I think, to my mind, there's four, I think, principal reasons for this. There are myriad of reasons, actually, but there's four that really come to the top of my mind. First off, there's just a lot of money in it. I mean, just look at how much money the ransomware people are getting and things like that. Stealing data is clearly a lucrative business, okay, at this stage of the game. Whether it is a ransomware attack or you're stealing account numbers or identity information or things like that so you can impersonate people and steal identities, it doesn't really matter how you do this. Or if you're a nation state actor, right, you're going here because that's where the data and the information you want to steal is for whatever your nation state advantage you're trying to develop is. The old saying that's attributed to Willie Sutton, although he claims he never said it, by the way, y'all, that when asked why he robbed banks, he says that's where the money is. Well, everything is digital today, including money. And of course, that's the reason why there's so much focus on trying to get into everybody's environment, because that's where it all is. The second reason is, in my book, is that cybersecurity has traditionally taken a backseat to the headlong rush to getting software to market. And this, unfortunately, has been true for as long as software has existed. And right now, it's actually even worse right now. And that's because of this little thing called IoT, right? We have got an explosion of additional devices that is increasing the threat surface by at least an order of magnitude here over the next couple of years in these IoT devices. And look at the number of breaches and the ability for people to exploit them that are existing. And so we are just continually to crank out code that itself is not fundamentally basically secure. And I think this is a huge problem that we have to begin to address and have to deal with up front. Third, and this actually goes to the other side of the equation as we think about how we build our software and build our system, build networks, but bluntly, good security is too hard. It is just too hard for the average person to be able to do it well, for the average company to be able to do it well. And in particular, it's too hard for SMBs or small and medium businesses that are out there. And two reasons for that. One, not only is it really hard to do, but talent is really, really hard to come by and very, very expensive. And so now you're caught in this awful catch-22 unless you can afford the really high-end talent, the high-priced guys that can help you actually do security well, or you're back there trying to set it up yourself. No matter how you do it, it's too hard, it's too difficult, not enough talent to go around, and the adversary knows this and they're counting on it. And in fact, if you look at a lot of the recent breaches that are happening, these are not direct attacks against well-armored companies, right, from a cybersecurity perspective. They have found a way into the door through third-party vectors in order to conduct the attack because they can get into their support network, their supply chain, or wherever it's going to be, and they get into these, they're really well protected through that avenue, as opposed to directly beating their head against that brick wall. And then finally, I will tell you that for the longest time, I have felt that we have been approaching security from the wrong direction, right? We've been really doing a perimeter slash, defense in depth approach to security. And the reality of that is, this is very important. You have to continue to do all that. But the reality is that the adversary is going to get in, right? It's not if, but when they get into your environment. And what we really need to be doing is focusing on what I've talked about for the longest time, as long as you've known me, Christy, this has been a hot topic for me, is what I've always called data-centric security, right? You know what the adversary wants. And as we design our systems and build our environments, what we want to do is we want to focus on what is it the adversary wants to get a hold of, right? They want your data and they want control. And then how do I minimize and limit their ability to get my data? How do I harden my data itself? And how do I ensure that even if the adversary gets into my system, they can't get out with anything that's useful across the board? How do I minimize the blast radius of the damage the adversary can do once they get inside the system? And that's how we need to begin to rethink about cybersecurity, starting from the inside, knowing they're going to get in there, out, as opposed to, in parallel with, is probably a better way to say that, in parallel with doing the perimeter defense and trying to prevent them from getting in it all across the board.
Fantastic, a great tie into there. As you mentioned, our current concept of cybersecurity is to defend against attacks and remedy failure by just erecting more and more and better defenses, right?
Right.
Trying to protect all the potential locations where data may be at any given time and anyone or thing that might access that data, right? This whole defense in depth methodology used by intelligence organizations and is really the backbone of most of the IT security strategies for large enterprises. So David, you come from a safety engineering background, which is a little bit different, and you have a little bit of an interesting take on the current defense in depth model used in cybersecurity as opposed to what you were trained in, which is more of that inherently safer design principle. Can you explain your thoughts on why you think the current cybersecurity solutions continue to fail?
Well, yeah, it's because it's mathematically impossible for them to succeed. And Gus mentioned this, he mentioned the attack surface, right? So if you count all the vulnerabilities, right? And when I say a vulnerability, right, you're talking about human vulnerabilities, people that can be socially engineered, that type of thing. You're talking about, unsecure coding, bad coding practices like Anand talked about. You're talking about all the potential network issues and so forth. So you take all of those vulnerabilities and then you multiply them by the possible vectors, right? And what I mean is take a human vector. So I'm a human vector, a way to get to it, and I have multiple devices, right, that I could be socially engineered to maybe give up my credentials for or something like that. So you take all the vulnerabilities and you take all the vectors and you multiply those and you get the possible number of cybersecurity failures, right? This sort of theoretical number. And then you take all the possible defenses for that. And then you start subtracting, right? You start saying, well, we can't cover all those particular type of vulnerabilities in a network, a hardware, or device, or we don't, as Gus said, we don't have enough people to be able to implement these measures. I mean, if you start doing the simple math, I mean, you did this as a word problem in your head, right? The number of the total cyber attack potential is always going to greatly exceed the total cyber attack defense potential. And then you factor in the asymmetry of the warfare. If you're a cyber defender trying to do defense in depth and you successfully defeat 1 million attacks, but you don't defeat one. In other words, the score is 1,000,000 to 1. Did you lose? Yeah, you lost, right? So it's mathematically impossible for a defense in depth strategy to succeed. And again, mirroring Gus, it doesn't mean that we don't have to do with these things. It means that on its own, it's not possible. So going back to the safety thing, the safety mindset it's not a security mindset. Security mindset says, how do we defend against all these attacks? It focuses on the bad guys. A safety approach looks at the data as hazardous, right? Because if it gets out in the wild, it gets stolen, it can cause harm, so it's hazardous. So it doesn't say, how do we protect the data? It asks the question, why is data stealable? Why can it be stolen? What is it about the nature of data that causes it to be an uncontrolled hazard? So that's the basic difference between a safety look at the problem and a security look at the problem.
So, Gus, you had talked a lot about in your answer the whole concept of this more data-centric security model, which it seems like is what David's really kind of discussing here, which I think also has a lot of tie-ins to the more zero trust methodology that we're hearing more and more about. You know, as you discussed, it's hard, but what, besides it just being hard, are there other barriers to adoption for these types of architectures in organizations?
Yeah. So I will tell you that probably the biggest mistake any organization makes is to approach solving this as a technology problem, as opposed to approaching this as solving it as a business problem. Right? You can't implement all this the data-centric security practices. You can't implement encryption. You can't implement data tagging and marking. You can't implement anonymization and all these other things like that that are important to be able to control and mask and hide and protect your data in the environment without being able to go to the business and say, how do you use data? What is the data used for? Who needs this data? When do they need it? How is it used? When is it appropriate? When is it not appropriate, right? How does the business function and operate? And the same is true for zero trust. Zero trust is a great solution to minimize the damage to the blast radius. What happens in zero trust implementations that typically don't go well is that they go in and they say, oh, it's a technology problem, go ahead and implement zero trust. And then the business rebels because it gets in their way of getting their business done, right? And it doesn't have to be that way. Right? If we go in and work on solving the problem of how do I harden my data, how do I implement zero trust intelligently, how do I implement the necessary policies and governance, rules, guidelines, and all those things like that, we're having to be thought through this ahead of time, right? So that's the most important thing. You don't start with technology, you start with the processes and the governance, and those other layers are on top of that. Because then you understand how the business functions, how the business works, and you can begin to implement these things in a manner that supports the business. I can tell you, having in the past done this at depth, it's a wonderful thing when you do it well, because what you can do is you can abstract away all the complexity from the user. The user doesn't have to know that encryption is happening. The user doesn't have to know whether or not you and I can share data. I can just simply say, hey, Christy, have you seen this? And the system can say, I'm sorry, Christy isn't clear to be able to see that piece of information. She can't see PCI data, or she can't see health data, or she can't see whatever it's going to be. You see what I'm saying? And so what we want to do when we do this, this is called thinking through the problem ahead of time, so that when you design it and you implement it, it actually makes the business function better, as opposed to getting in the way of getting business done. I will tell you, to close on this, is that whenever the security solutions get in the way of the average employee getting their job done, the average employee finds ways around the security, which only weakens it, right? And so it really behooves us to really seriously think through, and again, do those upfront steps of thinking through, how does the business function? What are the policies necessary? How is the data utilized? You know, all these things like that become critical. Which systems does any given person have to be able to touch and use and be able to get their job done effectively? Okay.
I think that's great. One of our poll questions is, which team is responsible for defining data protection requirements within an organization? And we're kind of all over, but about half of our audience, I think, was really smart and says it's multiple, right? It can't be owned by a single department, right? I think too often we see where it's, oh, this is IT security's problem, or this is legal, right, to define our terms, or everything else. And to your point, it's, you got to start with processes and policies and contracts, but then ultimately that has to be enforced all the way down and through the organization. And the easier you can make it, right, and the more user-friendly you can make it, so that to a certain extent it's even hidden. So it's people aren't having to try and find ways around it, right? Is often, I feel like, what's required. Transparent is my
favorite word when it comes to security. Yeah. No, we got to make it transparent to the user, because if it's in their way at all, they will do something or find some way around it. And all that does is make your security posture worse and not better. But I want to emphasize, you have to do it in concert with the business itself, right? So So the ownership, actually, if you really know who owns it, the ownership is at the executive level of the business itself, because they're responsible to make the business run well. And if they don't take ownership of it and don't take responsibility to ensure that as things get done, they get done in concert with how the business functions and operate, how the business workflow goes, right? Those things like that, then it's just not going to go very well at all. Okay. In fact, oftentimes it becomes a great big giant flop.
Christy, can I give a quick example for that?
Please, Anand.
Yeah, so I mean, Dish Network, our business is providing content. So to keep that content secure, that's like from the content provider, so ABC, NBC, movie studios, and we are taking that content, delivering to our customers. So this is our business need to make that content secure. Otherwise, we are not getting that content from the providers. So now that what Gus is talking about, this is a business issue. So now business wants to keep that content secure. So as a company, we all working towards to make it from our satellite uplink to download all the way to the hard drive on the set-top box. It's secure, and that's because business is also pushing it, just not engineers.
But that's huge, and I think you're touching on an important aspect. You know, your products, I should say, obviously of multiple, are designed for certain audiences and different customers. And so you understand to a certain extent that there are those expectations around that data protection, and it needs to be kind of inherently built into the software itself. And yet, I think in most organizations, as we've touched on, performance and usability features tend to always take precedence over data security and privacy. And that's probably particularly true in startups and smaller companies with more limited resources. I know we personally talk to a lot of software firms that rely on their customers to host their products in secure environments, and kind of use that as an excuse so that they don't have to build in native data protection features into their applications themselves. So, you know, Anand, in your experience as a software architect and engineer, at what stage of the software development lifecycle do organizations typically start talking about data security and privacy?
It depends on which industry you're talking about, but in a startup world, in an IoT world, it doesn't even come into play, because as a startup, as a founder, I want to take my product and go to market ASAP. So at that point, I'm not thinking about security or privacy or anything. What I'm thinking about is what is the problem my user is having and how I can solve it and take it to the market before somebody else does. So for the startup, yeah, it's really hard. So you have to build that in culture. Now, organization like Dish, where it is driven by the business and our stakeholders, then yeah, we think about this at the early stage. So I guess it depends on industry to industry. Like financial institution, they probably will think when they're building solutions about security. Yeah.
So, you know, I agree with you. I think left and right, there's a lot of software that gets a door. And I think particularly with new products is, you know, we've got to get that proof of concept. We got to get something out there. And then all of a sudden it gets to the point where you get adoption and things start to scale and there's no infrastructure in place or feature sets that are designed with more of that data security or data protection in mind. What have you seen in your experience, you know, mentoring other startups or even maybe in product development experience with past companies you've been a part of? You know, what are some of the potential repercussions of adding security solutions after an application has already gone live?
Oh, Christy, well, sorry, Anand, go for it.
No, go ahead.
Oh, no, I just, you know, Christy, what I've seen in kind of mentoring some of these things is like, it could kill your company. You know, depending on what size and scale it is, it can be pretty devastating. I know in past life for us, it's primarily been like regulatory or lawsuit driven that some of these features and functionality starts to enter to it. And unfortunately, you know, to add on to what Anand was saying, that tends to be kind of the initial driver, especially around requirements. It's like, all right, how do we not get sued? How do we not, you know, run afoul of these types of regulations that we know we have to comply with? But yeah, it can be pretty devastating unless you kind of are at least aware of what you have and how it can be leveraged against you. and then try to protect against that.
Christy, I'm trying to remember the social media company during the election when
Parler, are you talking about?
Parler, yeah. And that's a best example where they were not dealing about, I mean, it's a startup company and they're just trying to attract some customer, but when a lot of one party went to them, they have to scale very quickly. Security was not in place and they end up leaking a lot of data. So it can be like make or break.
Yeah. They end up leaking, I can't remember, it was terabytes of data simply because they had no bot protection on their on their private pages. So they're just able to go and scrape both public and private content out of the entire site. And they did it in a matter of days because nobody was paying attention.
Yeah. So I just had a question for you, David and Gus. So on the business side and the process side, how have you guys tried to emphasize the value of, instead of being like the boogeyman where it's going to kill your company, how do you start to explain those situations like, hey, this is actually a value add for you and is going to make your life better? How have you had success kind of getting startups or other companies to start thinking in those terms instead of like, this is just something we have to do to comply?
Well, frankly, it's a little rocky because it's just jarring because people are thinking, okay, especially it's at the startup, right? Here's this great idea that we have for this great service and this great product, right? And simply getting them to stop and think about this basic set of questions about how their data is going to be used, it just tends to come at them sideways because they're thinking about features and functionality. And they're in their minds, that's how we're going to get VC money. That's how we're going to, have a liquidity event that's going to allow me to buy that ranch in Montana that I've been lusting after, right? So getting to say, whoa, stop, slow down. The purpose of software is to manufacture and manage and manipulate data. The software is the means, the data is the end. So start thinking about this stuff from the endpoint of the perspective of the data. And that's just foreign thinking in a lot of cases, but it's absolutely necessary thinking. It's just kind of hard to get people to do that have been, maybe they've been developing for 20 years and they've had 2 successful startups and this is their next one. And you're asking them a question that they've never been asked before. So it's a little jarring. But it's necessary.
Yeah, it's an unfair question for me, Chris, because I come out of the intelligence community and our startup company is a cybersecurity company, and we have to then be able to sell back into the marketplaces we want to sell. So security has always been absolute top of mind, fully red team, the whole bit, all along the way. Without that, we wouldn't be successful in the slightest. So it's kind of unfair. I will tell you that I think a lot of the conversation that probably needs to happen, and particularly with their venture investor partners for these companies, is the fact that I think the legal regulatory frameworks are starting to shift and transfer. It used to be, the software, you could write that, that 5,000 page and 4-point type disclaimer about we have no responsibility whatsoever what happens to your system when you buy our software. And more and more, that's not holding up as people go to court to challenge these things, particularly when they go to court and discover that there were known problems that they just went ahead with anyhow, right? So if you're a startup company, talk to your venture partner. It becomes very important you do that. But the most important thing of all that you should do is you should be able to demonstrate successfully within a court of law or any form of a challenge that you at least are following some form of a security framework that is approved and makes sense, right? So as you build your software, how are you checking it? You've adopted DevSec practices, and here's how you're applying it on every time you do any work on code and you submit it back into the system. It's being checked thoroughly by the following other pieces of checking software, things like that. It doesn't matter how you do it as long as you have a formalized process in place that you can then point to that says we were following this, and because no software is ever perfect. Right? We have to know this going in. Did you try to do the best job you could to ameliorate any sorts of issues and problems as they came up and you know about them? Okay.
Yeah, and just to add to what you're saying, Gus, I feel the tides shifting from a consumer perspective in particular, that we're not, people are getting really frustrated with the amount of data that's being leaked, the amount of information that they are, signing up for services and being used without their knowledge. So it's good time to start thinking and preparing for when this inevitable shift happens, where the regulatory bodies are going to start to really come down hard. So we'll see how that works.
Just briefly, if you're a developer and you're working on an app that has really sensitive data, really sensitive or really confidential business data, currently, this won't last, but currently errors and omissions insurance for developers is cheap. If you're working on an app like that, get you some.
Yeah.
And Chris,
Hey, has anybody tried to renew insurance lately? Has anybody tried to renew insurance lately? The rates have gone explosively through the roof. So it's already happening.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Chris, I was going to say from the developer side, as a developer, I know every developer is proud of the code they write when they write it. After 10 years, they might not.
10 years, you're being generous.
But as a developer, when you write the code, I think, and then I want to make it clear that a secure developer is not a security expert. They still need somebody in the company to go and talk about security. But as a developer, you can be proud and then take certain steps, like understand the language. If you're using C, Java, or something else, understand what are the pitfalls of that language, like buffer overflows, things like that. How can I avoid them? Input validation is a big thing in the API world. Like when you get some input from a third party, validate it, that it follows whatever you want to do with it, it's correct. And then whitelisting things like who I can talk to in the third party APIs. So I'm not putting like I cannot talk to this person or this service. Instead of just say I can only talk to this service and that's it. Anybody else, we will just. So as a developer, you can go around and. So I think more it's like a culture, which needs to be cultivated in startups, and then be proud of your code.
So one of our questions was, how familiar are you as a developer with the various data security and privacy regulations impacting your company? And we've got about 64% of respondents said somewhat, and about 36 are saying not at all. Nobody's saying very. And I think that's very representative. I think actually having 64% say somewhat is good. We've got I think a more educated group here. And I think there has been a lot of it. That's not my area of responsibility. I don't really want to go there. And I think part of that has to do with this, again, that more of that collaboration mentality within the organization, that you've got, for instance, legal, who's writing these terms and conditions and these privacy policies and things along those lines. And then you've got the coders and who never read that and never really know what, in theory, the company is committed to doing and what their software service is supposed to therefore enforce. So I think right now there's this huge gap kind of between the policy makers and the technology development that could potentially enforce a portion of it. And that gap in between tends to be that miscommunication, human error land, where there's a lot of this, oh, well, I didn't know about this, therefore I'm not responsible. And I think that's where you're seeing a lot of these audits and others get people in trouble, because particularly if there's a policy in place that says you're going to do something and then you blatantly don't do it, ignorance is not bliss in that situation. That's where you're caught. So that's where I think this collaboration and communication can be so critical within these organizations. And you don't have to know the law, but you need to know what your company and your technology is supposed to be doing based on the contracts you have with your customers. That kind of ties it in. So, data security regulations have been around for decades, right, to provide guidance and best practices on how to protect a lot of sensitive data, like patient health records, financial information, so on and so forth. But we have been hearing a lot more about data privacy. And I think, Chris, that's what you were really starting to allude to, is consumers are starting to say, hey, data breaches, it's not just a security issue. This is now a privacy issue, right? And there's obviously been a growing number of national and local data privacy laws that have gone into effect, including the Colorado Privacy Act, which was just signed into law in July. David, you're a general data protection kind of a expert here for what's been going on in the EU, and I know you've kept your eye on a lot of what's been going on locally as well. Can you maybe help us better understand, what the differences and similarities are really between quote unquote data security and data privacy, and how data privacy maybe is impacting or needs to impact future product development initiatives?
Well, okay, so we'll do this at a couple levels. At the top level, the difference is basically it's legal, right? It's policy differences and so forth, because you're dealing with personal information when you're talking about privacy. So if you think about data security and data privacy at the top level, data security is for companies, data privacy is for individuals. So there's that distinction, and of course there's a different regulatory regime. But from a developer standpoint, because we're talking to a developer audience here, right? From a developer standpoint, in terms of a data-centric approach, it's all about controlling who has access to that data and what they can do with it when they have access to it, right? So at that point in time, at the policy level, companies, organizations, government organizations on one side, individuals on the other. At the operational level for a developer, there's no substantial difference, right? It's still about being able to control access to data and how that data is used. So they're essentially identical. Now they're use case driven, right? But it's all about being able to control just two simple things: access to data and what it can be used for once accessed. So from that standpoint, they're identical.
So I think we touched a little bit on
I'm sorry.
Oh, no, please go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I have an old adage, which is say, privacy and security. Well, you can't have good privacy if you don't have good security. Okay, that's just the bottom line fact of life. Okay.
I agree. I mean, I think in order for you to have any kind of opportunity for control, you have to at first restrict some degree of access, right? So there's always going to be that kind of security component that's a piece of that. And I think that's, we're talking a lot about data privacy. We're talking a lot about, in general, a lot more has been coming out in the news around how much data is collected on people that they don't necessarily know is being collected on them at any given point in time. And a lot of this has been driven, I think, by the explosion in more of the mobile and IoT or smart things devices that are now being used in a lot of everyday capacities that weren't previously. So I know, particularly Chris, you've had a lot of experience on this side, both as, being part of companies that were developing quote unquote smart things, as well as seeing a lot of the development initiatives that are going on, around this. How is the growth in kind of more of this edge computing and IoT impacting data risk and product design considerations?
I mean, it's a very dynamic process right now, just because depending on the industry, the types of data being generated might be mundane, like just temperature information, pressure, humidity, whatever. But then when you start to layer it into areas that have, knowing that data can give you a lot of side channel information that you normally wouldn't want access to. Like, hey, you know what, when that temperature goes up, that probably means a machine's running, or something else is going on in the facility that you don't want people to know what's going on inside of. Gus, I'm sure that you can resonate with that part of it. I think you said something, but there's a little bit of a delay there. So I missed it. Sorry, Gus. But the interesting part is, and what I'm seeing is that depending on where that data is being generated, there are scenarios where it's actually valuable for not only consumers, but also individual business units or whoever to share that information. So like one example, and Christy, we've had this conversation where if I've got like a Fitbit or a fitness tracker or something like that, I would love to share that with my doctor or healthcare provider or, diabetes studies or whatever. But I sure as heck don't want to just like, here's a database file with all this information. But I want to know who's accessing it and when. So that zero trust starts to become really interesting. And so as a product designer, what I would, and as a consumer myself, like I want to see companies thinking in those terms. Like I am more than happy to share information, but I want to be absolutely certain who's using it, when, and why. So that's where I'm hoping things are moving.
Absolutely. I think that's, again, that keeps coming down that notion of control. I think people, for the most part, appreciate data is valuable, and particularly most data really only gains value when it is shared, right? And used, whether it's either by multiple systems or applications or service providers. I mean, that's how you can get a lot of the value on it. But it comes down to, how is that data collected? How is it used? What visibility there is to that? How much control there is? And I think from a developer standpoint, I think that's maybe useful for people to understand that, it's not only understanding what it is that what data your application is collecting and processing, but ultimately is your software integrating with other applications, right, that may be using data differently, and therefore how does that, access and control need to be kind of applied. David, I think you had kind of a brief overview around some potential kind of design considerations that software developers might want to use in thinking about how to protect and control data at different aspects of a life cycle. Do you want to touch on that now?
Yeah, I do. And there's a simple construct. So everybody in this meeting has been at that design kickoff, right? Where you're starting to put requirements analysis up on a whiteboard or whatever, and you're starting to decompose them, right? So there's actually a really simple construct that you should go through, I think. And again, this I'm not going to go through this graphic all the way, and I think we're going to make it available after. Is that right? Correct, Ricky? But
absolutely, yeah, I will share it with everyone.
But data gets teased apart, it gets replicated, it gets glommed with other data. It changes from structured to semi-structured to structured and back. It gets used for all different kinds of things, right? So. But at the beginning, at the requirements analysis phase, you should be basically asking some simple question. And this should be the first thing that you decompose, kind of move this data security and data privacy to the left, right? Is who's got to have access to this data, who is not, on what devices or not, where, maybe geographically, if that's a concern, like it is for a lot of businesses, right, that have intellectual property protected. They shouldn't be able to open their data in China, right, for something like that. When can it be used? How long can it be used? And when, right? And then what are the purposes this data is supposed to be used for and not supposed to be used for? So if you're doing your initial decomposition and you start with those requirements, then everything else from your design should be able to support whatever you come up in that requirements analysis / decomposition exercise. The reason why that's important is that if you now look at this graphic, this data goes everywhere and gets used for everything in a lot of cases. And if you don't know where it's going or what it's used for, how it's being enriched, how it's being distributed, what it's being used for, all this stuff, who has the ability to create it. If you don't know this stuff, then you are always going to be perpetually behind in trying to figure out how to keep it private or make it secure. So don't get behind the power curve. First step of requirements analysis and decomposition is understand how this data is going to be used throughout its entire life cycle. Does that make sense?
I think we're following you, David.
Yeah.
Anand, I'm curious, in your experience, do you see these types of questions arising in companies like, for instance, that do have a calling to make sure that they have strong security functionality within their applications? Is this type of analysis taking place in the design and requirement stage?
Yeah, that is part of our initial design phase.
And who is involved in those conversations within the organization?
So because we are a big company, we have a team, a security team, which work with engineers and product management department together. So they have input on every stage of development. But for a startup, I think it has to, it will probably fall on a founder or co-founder or somebody in that very close circle to champion and follow this process.
Yeah, and that's all I wanted to add to what you were saying, Anand, is generally in startups and small organizations, it's somebody that has to be aware of, hey, we should think about this and make sure that it's on the product roadmap.
So I think that's probably one of the things is making sure there's somebody who at least is assigned, right, within the organization to keep an eye on this, and what their exact title is probably irrelevant, but somebody is charged.
Yeah, and I think companies like Abseil, you guys are doing a good job by educating people, like, hey, you need to think about this, so they can take this framework from David and then have a conversation about it. That's a big first step.
So, as a startup company, what I would really love to see as a mind shift change is when you go into whatever it is you're going to do, whatever you're going to develop, you should assume from the very beginning that whatever data you're creating, whatever data you're using, whatever data you're sharing needs appropriate protection out of the chute. Because it is too hard to go back and bolt it on after the fact. Look at what Zoom, we're on Zoom now. Remember how all the issues that Zoom went through trying to make Zoom secure after it started getting used too much? I don't know what that cost them as a company, but man, it couldn't have been cheap trying to add all these things on. So it's just too hard after the fact to bolt on effective security. So you got to go in assuming that this is the case up front. And then what happens is it just becomes part of the processes that you automatically put in place. So, if I had one plea I could give to anybody, please just go into it assuming your data is going to need protections and build it so that you build those in from the very beginning of whatever project program you're taking on. So.
Totally agree with Gus. I think, especially now that a general public is getting more and more aware of data security and privacy issues. So, yeah, at some point they will ask for it, and you have to provide it. And as a developer or architect, if you solve a problem at the early phase of your whole design life cycle, it's cheaper. The later you try to solve a problem or fix a bug, it's much more expensive.
Yeah, the biggest cost for Zoom, the biggest cost for Zoom wasn't the direct cost for fixing those problems. It's all the competitors that it spawned. Brave browser got into the business this week, and they did that. This is not rocket science. They did this because Zoom not taking care of this problem made them vulnerable. And they're going to pay for it. They're paying for it now.
Absolutely. We've had a number of questions that have come in, so let's. I thought maybe we'd try and tackle some here from the audience. One comes in here. When it comes to using third-party software, is the company that manages that service responsible for the data protection? And what kind of questions should we ask these companies to make sure we're protected, especially when we are using sensitive and transactional information such as credit cards, birth dates, etc.?
From a GDPR, CCPA, and CPA perspective, the Colorado Privacy Act, they are responsible for asking those questions, because those prescriptions, those laws or regulations they're not prescriptive, and they tell them you're going to use this kind of API or not. They're responsible for what happens to that information, period. So from an engineering standpoint, how can you fulfill that responsibility if you don't know how your APIs and services that you're calling, or SDKs if you're making software, you can't fulfill that responsibility without asking those questions, right? So from a legal perspective, yes, they're responsible. And I think there was a second part. What was the second part of that question?
It was just saying what questions should somebody, I think, who's looking to purchase a software service, what questions should they ask to make sure that they have thought about it?
Same questions, right? Who, what, when, where, on what devices, for how, same thing. How are you doing all that? And then let them answer. Of course, you'll probably get stunned silence, but the regulation, the way that they're written, you're responsible for asking those kind of questions. Or you're not made responsible in the regulation, but you're responsible for the results if you don't ask those questions and you get a breach or whatever.
I would also heavily advise looking through the terms of service of any of those companies that you're operating with, because I'm sure there's clauses in there where it's like, hey, you didn't send the data to our repository in the right manner, you didn't adhere to these policies. There's a lot of gotchas. Even though you're paying somebody to do this service for you, you always want to be aware of like, well, hey, you know what? We're only concerned about this area over here, so anything that happens outside of that is kind of on you. So data transmission, encryption policies. If it's a breach by an employee, are you liable for that, or is that something that they're liable for? There's all these different avenues. And Gus and David both mentioned this. Like, social engineering is a big problem, and knowing like if a breach occurs through a method like that, you might be responsible, even though you're paying for them to be, the security service provider there. So it's just something to be aware of.
Absolutely. Got another question here. Isn't cybersecurity an issue investors will start taking into consideration? I think we touched on this a little bit, but does anyone have something more to add on that, specifically as it relates to both the investor due diligence process and maybe ongoing accountability for organizations?
It depends on who your investors are. So some of them do a lot of due diligence, some of them don't. And I had a mentor once that his big thing is, if you don't have anything worth stealing in the house, don't buy a lock. So there's some investors are kind of thinking like that, like, hey.
But it's just the nature of the data, right? I mean, that's again, it goes back to the data question.
Yeah, exactly.
The software serves the data, not the other way around. So if you're a VC and you're looking at a company that's going to be handling regulated data of some sort, or something that even has in the IoT space that has life safety issues, better ask about security, or you're liable to see a very successful company get sued out of existence, and there goes your money.
Yeah. Or if you are an application that's touching sensitive data and your investor isn't asking those questions, maybe you should ask yourself, is this the investor that I want in my company?
That's a really good point.
But also keep in mind that I would hope that all investors begin to take this very seriously, because again, to the point I was making early on in this discussion, just because your software isn't handling sensitive data, if it becomes the vector by which they get into the sensitive data because you have a vulnerability that you just didn't bother to deal with in your system, I think more and more you're going to see that there's liability and responsibility that's going to be transferred, put on you, who had developed that piece of software that turned out to be the avenue by which people penetrated other more secure environments and things like that. So.
Yeah. A lot of company will take the viewpoint too that our term we'll get absolution ahead of time by the way we write our EULA or our terms of service. But we have 40 years of litigation in history in the United States where people tried to exempt themselves by using language, with product liability and things like that. And guess what? When it really harms people and you could prove it, the courts will just blow right through your contract language and say, no, that doesn't protect you. You knew how to solve this problem and you didn't. Pay up.
Yeah. And that's the due diligence phase, and that's why it's very important to really adopt full-blown DevSec ops practices when you engage and you're building your software, because you want security to be at the heart of everything that you're doing.
I can personally say this. We've done for the last several years, a significant percentage of the cybersecurity assessments that we've performed have been on behalf of private equity firms and VCs looking to acquire companies either as part of roll-ups or taking them from that startup to the scaling phase. And I have seen a number of them walk away from deals that just said this is going to be either prohibitively expensive to add in the type of privacy and security functionality that we need later, or there's so much risk that's already been put out there that we don't want to have to inherit. So it is something that I am increasingly seeing as part of that due diligence process, is that there has been thought put into this, both from the IT infrastructure of the company itself. You know, what have you done, as well as have you taken a serious stance on application security in the code and the software that you're developing? Another question here. In regards to ransomware attacks, backups are important. How much is enough in terms of backups, and what else should we prioritize for ransomware attacks? Gus, do you want to take that one?
Not really. I wish I had a great answer to ransomware, I have to tell you, but I really don't. I think the length of the backup is a function of how your business operates and what the business function is, and what it's going to take to get you back up online and functioning effectively in the minimum possible time. And that's going to vary from business to business. But that's what you really got to think about, is how fast can I get my business back online and essentially fully operational, because then I can go back and take care of the rest of the problem once I'm up and running. But if it's going to take you months to get up and running because you didn't do a sufficient job, planning for it, backing it up, both software and your systems, by the way. So let's just, both data and your software and your systems, things like that. Then you got a problem. So there's no hard answer to this other than what's the business need, and the business actually ought to run through an exercise where it looks at what happens would happen in a ransomware attack, and what would it take for us to get back up and going, so that then their IT department can actually plan appropriately, and they can purchase the right amount of backup storage and a reserve facility or something else along those lines.
I think another piece of this too is we're now seeing a lot of these double extortion pieces with ransomware. So the piece is business continuity is one aspect of that, right? You absolutely need to make sure that you're not losing money and business. But same point in time, even if you have those backups and you get back online quickly and they still have access to your data, they can come back still, and then you've got the data breach component as well. So ransomware continues to get uglier and uglier, I feel.
So, well, back online in my book means without the accompanying ransomware software still in your system. Okay, so let's just be clear about that.
You got to love the double whammy. We're going to steal you, we're going to lock you out of your stuff, and we're going to blackmail you.
Brilliant.
Well, once they got your data, that's the blackmail. But that goes to the point that we've been trying to get at here, which is they got to think about your data ahead of time. And how am I going to protect it, so that if somebody gets in and conducts a ransomware attack against your systems, hopefully, well, they get out the door as a bunch of encrypted garbage, instead of you having to deal with encryption on their end of the problem, they're going to deal with encryption on your end of the problem. The harder you can make this, right, the more likely it is they're going to go bother somebody else. Okay, that's still a true adage in the world of cybersecurity.
Just don't be the slowest guy, the slowest person.
Don't be the easy target. We've got several people who've asked some very, very good questions around how can you find trustworthy, talented, security literate focused developers, right? To build. Where do you find these guys? The programmers that actually specialize in this. Anybody want to take that one on?
Go to DEFCON.
DEFCON, that's what I was thinking of.
There are not many, and they're all busy. It's a real problem.
I think hiring them will be very expensive. So the other way is to go start mentoring people, and then go from there.
Yeah, I can say I think what we see a lot is startups and small companies hiring, lower cost developers, still good developers that can really build out that feature functionality, and then either bringing outside services or having, if you know somebody who is a senior, kind of more of a security architect who can just come in and on a consulting basis and then help, as Anand said, mentor those people or do code audits or help in that design architecture stage. So you set yourself up to be in a good spot. I think that can sometimes be a win-win, because especially if you're developing software that its core functionality isn't necessarily security, you probably don't need a full-time necessarily security engineer on staff. But as we talked about, you've got to have somebody who is focused on this, and when a data security or a data privacy technology question comes up, you have a go-to resource that can help walk you through that and can help guide you. So keep costs down, but still keep it top of mind would be my thought.
There's one company that I could recommend if people are looking for that fractional, DevSecOps talent or board or advisor or whatever. There's a company called Bolster, which is, I think it's a Colorado company. But for folks that are looking for just to connect with people in that vein, I found Bolster to be a good place to look.
And then going back to when I was talking about secure coder versus security expert, so you can go and have a security expert as a contract, but the people you're hiring, make sure they know how to write secure code, and that should be easier, because once you have secure code, you are already minimizing the impact of the landscape of threat.
Yeah, and I think keep just two domains, right? Secure code and secure data, right? And you have to do both, because got to do both.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I don't know if you saw the oops, I'm sorry, Christy. Are you going to say something?
No,
I was
go
going to say
ahead.
quickly, I don't know. Yeah, AI, everybody's looking to AI as the salvation for writing secure code. You saw the recent article that came out that said AI writes buggy code too. Insecure code too, I should say, right? Yeah. So.
Yeah.
The holistic approach.
Machine learning and AI are still only as good as what you're trained it on.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And we're not at Skynet yet. It's we're long way from that. I mean, you've got to have people look at the code and know what they're doing.
Absolutely.
And you got these long chains of causation, right? As Gus mentioned, you might not be the person that had the breach, but you might be the vector to it. So that's still the long chain of causation. It's still something that you got to have people think through, not a machine.
Absolutely. Well, we, believe it or not, are out of time. This is flown by. I want to personally thank all of our panelists. Thank you so much for being here. To the audience, we appreciate the questions. We hope you found value. And I know all of us, I think, are open if you guys have additional questions or want to reach out to us on LinkedIn or other avenues. We'd love to continue the conversation. So thank you so much, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.